Although American sentiment towards immigrants during the 1920s was based on the fear of usurpation by foreign values and foreign low-wage workers, and during the 1950s, it was based on the fear of infiltration by communists, the nativist and anti-communist movements during both post-war periods caused restrictive policies and rulings against minorities and other citizens that violated civil rights. In the 1920s, nationalist and anti-immigrant sympathies were rampant after the First World War, and many people feared that immigrants from Russia and southern Eastern Europe intended to overthrow the U.S. government. The end of World War I also caused production to decline and unemployment to rise, contributing to fears that radicals were going to start a revolution. These strikes were blamed on the Bolsheviks. The second Red Scare in the 1950s was during the post-World War II Cold War period. The tension between Soviets and the United States in the Cold War caused fear that communism would infiltrate every aspect of their lives. This fear of communism sparked a reorganization of federal policy.
The first Red Scare of 1919 to 1920 was an intense period of political intolerance inspired by the post-World War I strike wave and social tensions generated by the Russian Revolution. General A. Mitchell Palmer launched the Palmer Raids in 1920 because he was convinced that episodes like the Steel Strike were part of a worldwide communist conspiracy, and thus dispatched federal agents to raid offices of radical and labor organizations throughout the country with broad search warrants. Over 5,000 people were arrested, mostly without warrants, and held for months without charge, thus representing a severe abuse of civil liberties. The second Red Scare occurred in the 1950s, ushering in another period of targeting communists living in America. This era of McCarthyism was led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who announced in 1950 that he had a list of 205 communists working for the State Department. While the charges were preposterous, McCarthy used the Senate subcommittee he chaired to hold hearings and level wild charges against numerous individuals, as well as government agencies like the Defense Department. However, in the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, he was revealed as a bully who browbeat witnesses and made sweeping accusations with no basis in fact.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts.
The first Red Scare was primarily focused on dealing with immigrants and a homegrown revolutionary movement influenced by these immigrants, while the second one was concerned with infiltration by foreign communists and of spying by high government officials, which is why McCarthy was able to grow in prominence. However, these two Red Scares are similar in that both followed a war, and in both, communists were singled out with very little evidence and deprived of their freedoms of speech, belief, and assembly. The following public service announcement by the armed forces to the American public reflects the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
The Sacco Vanzetti case was at the height of the Red Scare when police arrested 2 Italian immigrants accused of participating in a robbery in Massachusetts. Very little evidence linked them to the crime, but they were still convicted because of the atmosphere of anti-radical and anti-immigrant fever. There was intense controversy because of the lack of substantial evidence, and many believed that they were prosecuted because they're immigrants from Italy and were avowed anarchists who advocated for the overthrow of capitalism. The trial attracted international attention during lengthy appeals that followed, and there were mass protests in Europe against their impending execution. The case demonstrated prejudice against those who espoused radical ideologies of anarchy, communism, or socialism. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a working-class Jewish communist couple from New York City. In 1951, they were convicted of conspiracy to pass secrets concerning atomic bombs to Soviet agents during World War II. Following the first successful nuclear test by the Soviets in 1949, America believed that Soviet spies must have been responsible for passing the nuclear technology from the United States to Russia. However, like the flimsy evidence in the Sacco Vanzetti case in 1920s, the case against Julius rested on highly secret docs that could not be revealed in court, and the government had almost no evidence against Ethel. However, the Sacco Vanzetti case demonstrated more a fear of Anaker's influence on the revolution in the United States, while the Rosenberg case represented the fear of foreign spies and the demonstration of nuclear power between Soviets and the U.S.
Leonard Wood, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in the early 1920s, emphasized the America First policy in one of his speeches. America First was an idea that loyalty to American values and American ideals should be first and foremost, as opposed to Southern and Eastern European values, especially those that revolved around communism. This idea was not new to American politics, but was further emphasized in the hysteria that immigrants were coming over and would be taking over and destroying American values in favor of communism. In 1947, President Truman signed Executive Order 9835, known as the Loyalty Order. This established the first general loyalty program, which was designed to root out communist influence in the U.S. federal government. It established a review system in which government employees were subject to demonstrate their patriotism without being allowed to confront accusers or knowing possible charges. The federal government dismissed several hundred persons in this manner, and thousands more resigned. This is a continuation of the loyalty ideals that we saw in the 1920s. With the omnipresence of the Cold War everywhere in American life, Executive Order 9835 was a codified manner of taking charge of this hysteria and making sure that no communist would be allowed anywhere near American systems of power.
The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 imposed the first overall numerical quota on immigration to the United States. The quotas were equal to 3% of the foreign-born population of that nationality in the 1910 census. Immigration from Asian countries continued to be barred. Nationality quotas did not apply to countries in the Western Hemisphere, government officials, or temporary visitors. Under this law, total annual immigration was capped at 350,000. The act proved in the long run to be the most important turning point in American immigration policy. The McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 continued the U.S.'s immigration policy of quotas from the 1920s. The act formally removed race as an exclusion for immigration and naturalization and granted Asian countries a minimum quota of 100 visas per year. The national origins quota changed from 3% to 1/6 of each nationality's population in the 1920 census. As a result, most immigrants came from the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany. Under this law, political activities, ideology, and mental health, among other criteria, served as a basis for exclusion and deportation. This law also created quota preferences for skilled immigrants and family reunification. Overall, setting up quotas for specific groups of people have been an integral part of U.S. immigration policy, and these quotas have led to further discrimination against immigrants in both the 1920s and 1950 time periods. Schenck v. U.S., Abrams v. U.S., and Gitlow v. New York are all Supreme Court cases which concern First Amendment rights. The first two occurred in 1919, while the third occurred in 1925. In Schenck v. U.S., Schenck was convicted of distributing flyers to men who could be drafted for World War I. These pamphlets urged resistance to conscription. The decision was unanimous for the U.S., and Justice Holmes's famous opinion set up the precedent that expressions which in the circumstances are intended to result in a crime and pose a clear and present danger of succeeding could be punished. Abrams v. U.S. concerned a group of Russian immigrants who distributed leaflets denouncing the sending of American troops to Russia and the U.S. efforts to impede on the Russian Revolution. The decision was 7-2 and upheld both the Sedition Act of 1918 and Holmes's earlier precedent. However, Holmes and Brandeis dissented because they believed the defendants had no intent to interfere with the war with Germany and posed no risk, and thus did not fulfill the clear and present danger. Lastly, Gitlow v. New York involved two Communist Party members who printed and distributed the Left-Wing Manifesto. The result decided that the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause required state and federal governments to be held to the same standards. It was another case in the 1920s which concerned First Amendment rights and rejected the clear and present danger for the bad tendency test.
Dennis versus United States was a Supreme Court case in which the General Secretary of the Communist Party during 1951, Eugene Dennis, was accused of making the creation of a plot to overthrow the government. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided 7-2 that the First Amendment of the United States Constitution did not apply because Dennis did not have the right under the First Amendment to exercise free speech, publication, and assembly if the exercise involved the creation of a plot to overthrow the government. This relates to the 1920s cases like Schenck versus U.S., Abrahams versus U.S., and Glitvo versus New York because it shows how the U.S. government, in the face of heightened panic over things like the Red Scares and anti-immigrant sentiments, restricted First Amendment rights. With increasing fear about immigrants arriving with communist and socialist values, President Clute signed into law the Immigration Act of 1924. This act sought to severely restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries, Arab countries, and East Asian countries. They accomplished this by setting quotas to be percentages of 1890 immigration levels, in which countries from Southern and Eastern Europe were severely underrepresented. They feared that immigrants, especially those from Southern and Eastern European countries, were communists, and therefore they felt the need to pass this act. Operation Wetback was an immigration law created in joint with the U.S. and Mexico immigration services. This started out as a cooperative movement of moving the illegal Mexican laborers who came into the United States to work as migrants on farms back into Mexico. However, as time went on, the U.S. Border Patrol started removing Mexican citizens and deporting them without actually proving that they were not citizens, which were extreme civil rights violations because due process was not being followed and they were being expelled without given any chance to prove or being told what their charges were. This was a continuation of the 1920s severe immigration laws that the U.S. implemented. Both of them reflected anger and misery of the common American people over immigrants who were coming over and doing perceived harm to the country.
All in all, the 1920s and 1950s reflected similar anti-immigrant and anti-communist sentiments, demonstrating the ingrained sense of pro-democracy and nativism still present today. Although Americans have come far in promoting tolerance, anti-immigration beliefs are still present in acts such as Donald Trump's recent executive order banning citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States for the next 90 days.